I get asked quite often, what's your favorite video game console ever, right? And that's a tough one. I've probably given answers in the past. Maybe it's changed a few times. But today I want to go about this a little differently. I want to think about if I could relive the launch of a console, what console would that be? And I want to pose that question to you guys as well. Really curious to see what your responses will be on that. Now, for me, it's an interesting one because I've lived through a lot of different console launches, and the one that I'm picking is the Super Nintendo. The Super Nintendo, it launched August 23rd, 1991 in the US, but I didn't own one when it first came out. It wasn't for almost a couple years later that I actually bought one myself, but I'm extremely nostalgic for it. Nostalgia is a crazy thing. Like, sense of smell could trigger nostalgia for something. Watching a TV show, a movie, a memory you had, the people you were around at a given time, just those experiences can trigger nostalgia for something. Like buy like an NES game that's brand new, sealed in the box, and just like open that seal and smell the plastic and the manual. It's the same thing with like Magic the Gathering cards from way back in the early 90s. Like there was a certain smell to those compared to now. The same thing with video games. Weird, right? I mean, am I the only one who thinks of that kind of stuff? But yeah, those things can trigger nostalgia. And for me, the Super Nintendo is about who I was around, the experiences I had. And I did get to play the Super Nintendo on launch. And even remembering building up to launch, I had a subscription to Nintendo Power. So you were getting all the information, what was coming out, what the games looked like. And it was a crazy time. But I had a friend at that time. He was my best friend. His name was Jarrell. He was named after Superman's dad, right? Pretty crazy stuff. But he got a Super Nintendo the day it came out. And I remember spending the night at his house. Spent the night over there quite often. We were always playing video games and hanging out, causing trouble and whatnot. But we played Super Mario World all night until we beat it. We just stayed up. We stayed up all night playing that game until we completed it. And I remember there used to be these like ma and pa video game stores where you could trade in games. Like if you finished a game, you could take it in and like trade it for another game. And like, I remember this one specific store. It was next to a liquor store that we used to go to all the time. We'd go to this liquor store because they had arcade cabinets in there. We'd buy some candies and snacks and play arcade games. But this little ma and pa video game store, they would have like different color coded stickers on the games. And like if you had a game that was categorized red, you could trade for that for $5. But if you were trying to trade something that was lower grade, you couldn't do it for that. You'd have to give more money, that kind of thing. It was an interesting premise. I'm sure a lot of places did that. But we used to go to that place quite often and trade like Atari games and NES games for, other games to play. But I remember going to that store the next day, the day after the launch of the Super Nintendo. And we were younger. We were just, full of ourselves. And we're like, yo, we beat Super Mario World. What do you think about that type of thing? Just bragging, being stupid. And the guy was like, you guys didn't beat Super Mario World. You guys probably don't even have it. Like, what happened? And we explained, what happened at the end of the game. And the guy was just like, okay, whatever, man. Like, if you're ready to trade that stuff in, bring it in. Like hurry up and give me your Super Nintendo type of thing, right? But besides just that, like experiencing that console and the games with my friend, the experiences I had myself when I finally got one of my own. But even like before then, like who remembers Street Fighter 2 coming out for the Super Nintendo? That was ridiculous. I know I bring this up quite often, but like arcade games on home consoles, especially back in the day, was just an amazing thing. You're not having to pump quarters in a machine. You could play this at home. And sure, on the NES was still hot when the Super Nintendo came out, by the way. Like in 91, Battletoads came out. Like there was still a lot of NES games coming out. It was still a very hot system. I was playing the crap out of it. But, on the NES, you had a lot of arcade ports, and they didn't quite live up to the original. There were some, like, older arcade games that were fairly close ports. But it wasn't, at least for me, until the Super Nintendo, seeing games like Street Fighter 2 where it was like, holy crap, this really is an arcade at home. Like, this is amazing stuff. And Street Fighter 2, just vanilla Street Fighter 2 on the Super Nintendo was just a huge, huge event. I remember my friend wanting to get it and we couldn't find it anywhere. It was just sold out. Like, I don't know if the stores didn't get very many or they didn't anticipate, like, you know, the popularity of it, how many people were going to want it. But I remember at the Montclair Mall in California, I believe it's called Montclair Plaza. The mall still exists, but it's nothing like it was back in the 90s. They had an arcade, all sorts of cool stuff, comic book store inside. Now they don't have none of that. But there was like this kiosk, like center, like shop, like how the malls have now. Like there'll be a little store and they'll sell stuff. Well, there's a Capcom store like that in this mall. And it was on the second level. This little Capcom booth, they only sold Capcom games. It was Capcom. It was a Capcom booth. They sold a ton of, like, you know, Super Nintendo, Genesis, Super Nintendo. That's all they sold, just Capcom games. If you wanted their games, that's where you went. And they had one copy of Street Fighter 2 left. And we grabbed it and just went back to his place and just enjoyed the hell out of this game. It was nuts, man. Like, you had tons of games like that where it was like, holy crap, they really did this on the Super Nintendo. Now, when I finally got one myself, which was almost a couple years later, it was the first console that I paid my own money for. I had other consoles, the Atari 2600, the NES, but I didn't buy them with my own money. They were, you know, like family members bought them. But the Super Nintendo was the first one where I saved every penny that I could find. If I went by a newspaper machine, I checked if there were quarters or anything in the little coin tray. Like, hey, maybe you'll find some payphones. Hey man, maybe there'll be a nickel or a dime in there. Like, ooh, I found a quarter on the floor. Oh, I found $1. Oh, I'm gonna save my lunch money. You know, all that kind of stuff. Like, I just saved money, sold candy, did like whatever I could to make enough money to buy the Super Nintendo. And I don't remember how much it cost at that time, but the way I got it was I put one on layaway at Walmart, actually. It's crazy enough. Like, I don't really care for Walmart anymore, but back then, you could put stuff on layaway like any time of year. And I got the Super Nintendo, put it on layaway, and saved up all that money that I could and just paid it off and picked it up. And when I picked it up, the first game that I bought was Sunset Riders. Another arcade like classic, just game that you couldn't believe you could play at home. And Sunset Riders it blew me away because I played it all the time in the arcade. And now it was like, okay, I'm playing catch up because all I ever did was play this console at my friend's house for the past almost couple years. And there were some great experiences with that. I got like really hooked into role-playing games as well. On the Super Nintendo, that was like the home of the role-playing games at the time anyway. I mean, PlayStation became that later on. But I remember my friend playing Final Fantasy II, and I'd played it, the first one, on the NES, and I enjoyed it, but seeing this new Final Fantasy just got me hooked. And then I just remember staying the night, and his older brother would play it, and, you know, before YouTube, before Twitch, I'm just sitting back watching him play this game and just being like amazed by it, and like, oh my god, I can't wait to have this game myself. And that's one of the reasons like Final Fantasy II is one of my all-time favorite games. Just remembering that time, the people I was around, the fun that I had. It just, you know, it stuck with me. Eventually I got that game myself. And then like when Final Fantasy III came out, that was a game that like, you know, people say they use games as an escape. And I remember, you know, not like getting into any crazy detail, but I kind of feel like at that time when Final Fantasy III came out, like my life was like kind of shitty a bit. Like there was like just weird things going on, and I really needed an escape, and Final Fantasy III provided that for me. And if it wasn't a good game, I would have had to find something else. But Final Fantasy III was like, I was skipping dinner. I was like just up all the time playing this game. And just, that is very memorable to me. Like using that game as an escape from just, you know, bad times, I guess you would say. And it was just such a beautiful game. And, you know, using it in that regards, and then just every game that came out, you know, playing Legend of Zelda, you know, Link to the Past, Super Metroid, Pilot Wings, Super Mario Kart. I remember another friend of mine later on, like he would always have these parties, and we would go over to his house and play Super Mario Kart on the Super Nintendo, and play against each other, like have tournaments. It'd be a bunch of us just playing it. Like there's just so many damn great memories of the Super Nintendo that I mean, I can't deny it. Like, I would love to relive that stuff. You know, in the mid 90s, we had Pogs. I love Pogs. Like, it's just that time period, the 90s, like, was just so awesome. The TV shows, the movies that came out. Like, I'm nostalgic for the 80s too, but just the 90s, there's just something great about it. And definitely that early to mid 90s was a great time for gaming. And if I could choose to go back and re-experience it, the Super Nintendo would be it, because I can't think of any other console that I've been so excited for. Plenty of consoles I've been excited for and the games that came out for them, but the Super Nintendo was just so damn magical that I can't deny it. I've never experienced a system like that again, other than with role-playing games on like the PlayStation 1. The PlayStation 1 was a magical time too, not to take away from that, but growing up Nintendo, that Super Nintendo, holy crap, all the role-playing games that came out for it, all the different genres, like it was like well covered, and there was just so many awesome games for the console. Definitely an amazing time. So let me know, which system would you pick and why? I read all the comments, guys. Really do appreciate everything. Hit that like button if you don't mind. Drop that comment, subscribe, do all that good stuff. Really helps me out, helps my channel to continue to grow. So if you want to see me continue to do the things that I do, that's kind of stuff you could do to help me so we can continue on. Now, with that said, really do appreciate you guys, and I will catch y'all next time. Peace out, bye-bye, and boom. Bye.